The first canister hit somewhere over Lagos at 4:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still awake, 3 cups of cold coffee, deep into a threat assessment report that nobody in Geneva was going to read. Anyway, my screen was full of numbers. Then the numbers stopped mattering. The alert came through as a single line of red text, 14 objects orbital. Insertion non-terrestrial origin. I read it twice, then I put my coffee down. Very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands have gone slightly wrong, and I pulled up the tracking feed. 14 dreadnoughts hung over the planet, like bad news waiting to be delivered. I had spent 11 years studying the Verk. Not their ships, not their weapons. Their biology, their behavioral patterns, the way they move through. Problem: every xenobiologist on the UN's research list had read the same files, drawn the same conclusions, written the same warnings in the same careful academic language that governments everywhere had filed and forgot. Verk did not negotiate, the Verk did not threat, the Verk arrived, assessed, and acted. 11 worlds in their recorded history. 11 worlds that had gone quiet. The general's voice came through my earpiece before I had finished processing the feed. He was already talking about missiles. I let him finish. Then I said, "General, missiles will not help you." He asked me what would help. I told him I needed 6 hours in a classified channel. He gave me 4. The canisters began dropping at 5:03. I watched them on thermal imaging, 18 of them per dreadnought falling through the atmosphere in tight spiraling patterns that I recognized from the Verk files. Deployment formation Delta 7, I had named it myself 8 years ago in a paper that 3 people had cited and no government had read. Delta 7 was not an attack pattern, it was a release pattern. There was a difference. Attacks were aimed at infrastructure, at command structures, at the things that made a civilization function. Release patterns were aimed at population density, open land, river valleys, forests. They were not trying to break us. They were trying to feed something. The feeds from Lagos came in first, then Nairobi, then the one from outside Sao Paulo that I watched for 40 seconds. Before I stopped watching it, the harvesters were exactly what the files had described. 6M at the shoulder. Bilateral symmetry, but wrong in the way that made your eyes slide off the shape before your brain could finish categorizing it. Faster than anything that size had any right to be. The Verk had spent 3 centuries engineering them. They were not animals. They were not weapons. They were closer to a philosophy, the philosophy being nothing in this environment should be alive that we have not decided should be alive. Conventional rounds did what conventional rounds always do against a thing that has been specifically designed to absorb and continue. The field reports coming and used words like ineffective and insufficient. I would have used different words. I would have used the word expected. I pulled up the kill pattern data at 6:15. The harvesters were moving in coordinated sweeps, which meant they were still in the first phase, still operating on Verk command signals, still controllable from orbit, that would change within 72 hours. Once entered phase 2, the Verk signals would drop off and the harvesters would begin operating on pure territorial instinct. At that point, the problem would stop being military and start being something for which we did not have a good word. Yet, I was building the pattern overlay, cross-referencing the sweep coordinates against the terrain data when I stopped typing. I looked at the screen for a long time. The pattern was not VERC, the sweep. Vectors, the spacing between units, the slight irregularity in the southern hemisphere clusters, it matched something, but it did not match anything. In the VERC operational files, it matched something else, something older, something I had written about in a different context entirely, in a paper that had never been published, in a facility that did not have a public address. My hands were still on the keyboard. I was aware of the general still talking. In my earpiece, I was aware of the alert feed cycling through new cities, new coordinates, new numbers that had stopped being numbers and become something else entirely. I was aware of all of it. I was not hearing any of it, because I had seen that pattern before. And the last time I had seen it, 6 people who had been drinking coffee with me that morning had not made it to the evening. I had never told anyone why. I had never written it in any report. I had taken that information, and I had folded it very small, and I had put it somewhere I did not look, the way you learn to not look at certain things when looking at them does not help you function. I took the earpiece out, set it on the desk, looked at the pattern on my screen for another 40 seconds. Then I put the earpiece back in and interrupted the general mid-sentence. I need a classified channel, I said. Not your classified, the other one. Silence on the line. The kind of silence. That meant he knew exactly what I was referring to and had been hoping nobody would refer to it. Dr. Osai, he said. I know what I'm asking for. The protocols on that channel require. General, I kept my voice very flat and very even, the way I had learned to keep it in rooms where flatness and evenness were the only thing standing between a conversation and a catastrophe. Pull up the harvester deployment overlay. Southern Hemisphere cluster, tell me what it looks like to you. A pause, he was looking at it. It looks like a standard sweep pattern, he said. It looks like a standard sweep pattern, I agreed. Now overlay it with the file I'm sending you. The one from 2031. The one with the red classification header that you are going to need to call 3 separate people to unlock. I sent the file. I waited. The silence this time was different. Longer, heavier, the kind of silence that happens when a person looks at 2 things side by side and understands, without wanting to, that they match. Lord have patience, I said quietly. Not to him, to nobody, to the 6 names. I did not say out loud. Dr. Os, his voice had changed. Are you telling me that the VERC harvesters are following a pattern that originates from? I am telling you, I said, that someone or something gave the VERC map, and the map was drawn by something that has been on this planet a great deal longer than the VERC have known we exist. Another silence. What do you need? He asked. I had already written it out, 7 words typed into the classified request form sent before he finished asking the question. Authorized site Vantablack, all 3 containment levels. He called me back 40 seconds later. He asked me if I was serious. I told him I was always serious. I told him I had not been unserious a single day in my professional life, and that today was not the day I was planning to start. What I did not tell him was that my Hands under the desk where the camera feed could not see them were shaking in a way they had not shaken since 2031. Not from fear, from recognition. The harvesters were the most dangerous things the Verk had ever engineered. The file said so, every threat. Assessment said so, 11 worlds of evidence said so. The files were written by people who did not know what I knew. The harvesters were not the most dangerous things on this planet. Not even close. The drive to Site Vantablack took 9 hours, most of it through a landscape that looked like it had given up on the concept of normal. The highway north of Sudbury was empty in both directions, except for military convoys going the other way, away from something, and I did not ask what. The harvester feeds on my tablet had gone to static somewhere around the Ontario border, which meant either the relay towers were down or someone had decided I did not need to know what was happening in real time. I had decided that was probably fine. I had enough to think about. The facility entrance was a concrete service road marked with a sign for a water treatment station that had never treated any water. There was a guard post, then another guard post, then a long elevator ride that went down far enough that your ears popped twice, and then a set of blast doors that had been designed by someone who had been genuinely frightened when they designed them. I had been here 3 times before. The first time I had been part of the original research team, 26 years old and certain I was about to make the discovery of my career. The second time I had been part of the recovery team, 31 years old, writing names into a report with hands that kept stopping. The third time was now. The facility director met me at the bottom of the elevator. His name was Colin Marsh, mid-50s, the kind of face that looked like it had been worrying about something specific for a very long time. He handed me a badge and a coffee, and I took the coffee because it was the same coffee, the same brand, the same terrible vending machine blend that had been here in 2031. And I drank it because not drinking it would have meant acknowledging why I noticed. Command has sent authorization for levels 1 through 3, he said. Full containment access. I know I asked for it. I know you did. He looked at me in the way people look at you when they want to ask a question and have decided not to. The general briefed me on the deployment overlay. Good, then you understand why we're here. We walked through the main corridor. White walls, fluorescent light, the low hum of ventilation systems moving air through a space that needed a great deal of air moved through it. The facility was technically divided into 3 containment levels, which was a bureaucratic way of organizing something that defied bureaucratic organization. Level 1 was the research floor, files and samples, and the kind of careful scientific documentation that made everything look manageable on paper. Level 2 was observation, the monitored chambers, the feeds, the biological data, running on servers that were not connected to any external network. Level 3 was the part that did not have a name in any official document. Staff called it the basement. I did not call it anything. Naming it felt like an invitation. Colin walked me through the briefing room where 3 scientists I did not recognize were standing around a holographic display of the harvester deployment, their faces carrying the specific expression of people who have recently been told something that has rearranged their understanding of several things at once. I nodded at them, they nodded back. Nobody had anything useful to say yet. The pattern match is consistent across all 6 continental clusters, said the youngest of the 3, a woman named Dr. Paula Stride, voice flat and careful. The way that meant she was keeping something steadier than she felt. Whatever generated the original map. The Verk have been following it precisely, down to the terrain variants. Corrections. They were given it, I said. Given it by what? I looked at the display. I looked at the 6 bright clusters burning over 6 continents. I thought about 11 worlds. That, I said, is the second problem. The first problem is what we're going to do about the harvesters. I pulled up a chair and opened my tablet and began the briefing that I had been constructing in my head for 9 hours on an empty highway with military convoys going the other way. I talked through the Verk deployment phases. I talked through the 72-hour window before the harvesters went autonomous. I talked through every conventional option and the reasons each one ended in the same place, which was not a good place. Then I pulled up a file that made Colin sit down heavily in his chair, without appearing to notice he had done it. The file was mine. I had written most of it between 2026 and 2031. The last 3 pages had been written by someone else in a different handwriting, and then completed by me after the fact, because the someone else had not been available to finish them. I did not look at the name at the top of those pages. I never did. What we have in level 3, I said, are 6 entities, not Verk, not anything the Verk have cataloged, not anything with a genus or a species designation that holds up under scrutiny, because the standard frameworks for classification assume a thing evolved in a linear way from something smaller, and these did not. The genetic sequencing we managed before the 2031 incident suggests origins that predate every terrestrial evolutionary branch point we have mapped. They should not exist here. You want to release them, said Colin. Not a question. I want to consider it as an option. The containment protocols were written by people who were afraid. I said that was appropriate, but fear is not a strategy. Paula was looking at the display. If the harvesters follow the same map that the entities apparently generated, would that mean the entities and the harvesters are in the same food chain? I said yes. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens before someone speaks. The kind that happens when everyone in the room has just understood something at the same moment, and none of them wants to be the first to say it out loud. The harvesters are apex predators, said the third scientist, a man named Dr. Owen Farr, very quietly. By every metric we have, there is nothing in the Verk files that sits above them. The Verk files, I said, document 11 worlds. On 11 worlds, nobody had a level 3. I closed the file. I stood up. I did not look at the east corridor, the one that went to the older section of the facility, the one with the 7 storage lockers that had been retrofitted into memorials that nobody officially acknowledged. I need the ethics board convened in 2 hours, I said, and I need the general on a secure line, and I need someone to tell the kitchen to stop buying this brand of coffee. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Colin said, the ethics board is going to say no. I know. So will the general initially. I know that too. What are you going to say to them? I looked at the display. 6 clusters. 6 continents, the clock in the corner. Reading 51 hours and 17 minutes too. Harvester autonomy. I'm going to say the same thing I always say, I told him. I'm going to put 2 sets of numbers next to each other and let the numbers do the talking. The ethics board said no. I put the numbers next to each other. They said yes. The authorization came through at 11:47. That night, it had 17 signatures on it, which was 16 more than anything I had ever submitted before. I read all 17 names. I recognized 4 of them as people who had specifically argued against my research in peer-reviewed journals. Fear, it turned out, was very good at changing minds. I went to my assigned bunk and lay on my back in the dark and stared at the ceiling of a facility buried under 400 m of granite and thought about the east corridor and the 7 lockers and the brand of coffee I had requested they stopped buying and did not request an explanation for. In the morning, I began the release protocol. My hands only shook once, which I considered a professional achievement. The first thing I did wrong was assumed the release would look like the simulations. The simulations were clean, modeled vectors, projected movement corridors, behavioral prediction matrices built from 6 years of observation data. Paula had run them 40 times. Owen had run them 20 more. Every iteration showed the entities moving into the designated harvester dead zones following the territorial instincts the observation data had cataloged, engaging in the behavior the files described in the careful neutral language of science. Trying not to panic. Entity 1 went southwest, correct. Entity 2 went northeast, correct. Entity 4, 5, and 6 moved into their designated corridors within the first 6 hours, and the feeds from those zones showed exactly what we had modeled, which was a kind of efficiency that made the word efficient feel insufficient. Entity 3 went north, not northwest, which was the projection, not northeast, which was the secondary model, north, straight north, moving at a speed that our surface monitors caught in fragmented thermal pulses, crossing terrain in a pattern that the movement prediction software kept failing to categorize because it did not match any animal locomotion database we had. The harvester feeds from the northern zones had gone quiet 4 hours before Entity 3 reached them. I noticed this sitting in the mobile command unit outside the facility entrance, watching 3 screens simultaneously, and I said nothing about it to the people around me for approximately 11 minutes while I thought about what it meant. It meant Entity 3 had not gone north because of the harvesters. It had gone north for a different reason. I got into a vehicle and drove north without telling anyone where I was going, which was not the correct protocol. Paula called me twice. Owen called me once. The general called me 4 times. I answered the general on the 4th call and told him I was following an anomalous deviation and would report in when I had something to report. He told me that was not how field operations worked. I told him I had never technically been a field operative. I was a xenobiologist, and therefore his operational framework did not strictly apply to me. He made a sound that was not quite a word, and I kept driving. The landscape north of the facility was Canadian shield in late autumn, gray. Rock and bare birch, and a sky the color of something that had decided not to commit to either cloud or clear. The roads were empty. The relay towers were down in this sector, which meant my tablet was running on cached data, which meant I was driving through a landscape where the only real-time information I had was what I could see through the windshield. What I could see was a suburb at the edge of a mid-sized town that had been evacuated 31 hours ago. And at the edge of that suburb, standing in a strip mall parking lot between a chain pharmacy and a furniture store, something the size of a grain silo. I stopped the vehicle approximately 200 m away. I turned the engine off. I sat in the quiet for a moment, which was very quiet, which was the kind of quiet that a landscape makes when everything that normally makes noise in it is left. Entity 3 did not move. It was facing me. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say it was facing me, because precision matters and language gets lazy under pressure. It was not oriented in my direction the way an animal orient toward a sound or a smell. It was facing me the way a person faces someone they have been waiting for. There was no threat in it. There was no display. There was nothing the behavioral files called an aggression posture. It was waiting. I sat in my vehicle for 4 minutes. The feeds I could still access were showing the harvester zones going quiet one by one across 3 northern provinces, which was information that should have been requiring my attention. I got out of the vehicle. I sat on the hood. 200 m of empty parking lot between us. The wind was doing what wind does in November in northern Ontario, which is commit fully to being unpleasant. Entity 3's outline against the gray sky did that thing it always did in direct observation, where your eyes tried to find the shape and the shape kept being slightly elsewhere than you were looking, not because it was moving, but because it existed in a way that standard visual processing had not been designed to handle. I had first encountered that quality in 2031. It had taken me 3 weeks to stop finding it disorienting. The scientists who had been with me then had never gotten those 3 weeks. I thought about that. I thought about North and why North and what North meant if you had been contained in a facility for 15 years and the first time the doors opened you, not toward the largest concentration of the things that were your nearest natural equivalent to food, but toward a specific person in a specific vehicle on a specific road. I did not have a scientific framework for what I was thinking. The radio in the vehicle behind me was going loud with voices I was not listening to. I turned it off. Entity 3 had not moved, neither had I. The parking lot sat between us like a question that neither of us was in. I hurried to answer. I stayed on the hood of the vehicle until the sky started going dark at the edges. Then I got back in and drove back to the mobile command unit and wrote a field note that I did not send to anyone that I marked as personal and locked with a code I had not used since 2031. It said it knew where I was. It came to me first. It waited. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did what I always did with the things I could not explain in the frameworks I had been given. I wrote a new framework. The cargo container was Paula's idea. She had found it in the port inventory, listed under general freight, 8M by 3, sitting in a Rotterdam yard next to a stack of identical containers that would provide exactly the kind of structural ambiguity that the general had insisted on when he said he would not authorize a meeting inside any building that was also a potential military target. I had not asked why a cargo container was preferable to a building. I had decided that question could wait. The Verk negotiator arrived at dawn, alone, the way the intercepted signal had said it would. Our translators had been running Verk linguistic models for 30 years, which was long enough to manage functional communication and not long enough to be certain you were not missing something essential in the middle of a sentence. I was standing inside the container when it entered. Colin was 3M behind me. 2 military escorts stood at the door, which was as far as the general had agreed to stand his people back, which I had accepted because arguing about it would have cost time we did not have. The Verk negotiator was not what I had expected. I had spent 11 years studying the Verk through their biology, their behavioral patterns, their engineering outputs. The picture the files built was of a species that expressed everything through scale. Large ships, large weapons, large engineered predators, scale as a statement of intent. I had internalized that picture without fully realizing it. The negotiator was small, not small by human standards particularly, perhaps a 1.75 meters, narrow through the body in a way the larger Verk were not. Old in the way that age shows in a species, something in the surface texture of the skin, something in the way it held its weight slightly forward. It came through the container door and looked at me with 2 eyes set wide in a face that was not built for expressions, but was nonetheless expressing something. It sat down on the container floor. I sat down across from it. Neither of us said anything for about 30 seconds, which the translator was rendering as a recognized opening protocol, a deliberate mutual silence that the files had documented, but which I had never experienced directly. In the files it had always seemed formal. In the container with the port sounds bleeding in from outside and the morning light coming through the gap in the door, it felt almost courteous. The Verk spoke first. The translator rendered it in flat English, stripped of whatever tonal quality the original had carried. You released the prior ones. We did, I said. You had them contained. We did. For how long? 15 years since the formal program. Evidence suggests they were first contained several centuries before that by people who did not understand what they were containing. The negotiator was still for a moment. Then the other worlds did not contain them. I know. The other worlds attempted removal. Destruction. I know that too. Something moved across its face that the translator flagged as unclassified and offered 3 possible interpretations, for none of which felt entirely right. I filed it and moved on. You have an offer, I said. We withdraw the harvesters, it said. We leave this world undisturbed. Your civilization continues. Your infrastructure continues. Your population continues. In exchange for the entities. Yes, you've made this offer before on other worlds. It did not answer immediately. The offer was not relevant on other worlds, it said finally. The prior ones were not containable by the time we arrived. They were in population centers. They were unmanageable. The offer was not relevant. I sat with that. But here you're making it, I said. Here they are contained. Here they are Manageable, here they can be. Transferred. Why do you want them? Another pause longer. They are a hazard, it said. To whom? The translator flagged the response as a non-answer, which was not a translation. Failure, that was the actual content of what it had said. I pushed. The harvesters are your apex predators. I said engineered, optimized. You've used them across 11 worlds, but you came to those worlds because something was already there, something you were sent to address. I want to know who sent you. The container went very quiet. Colin shifted behind me. I held up one hand without looking back. The negotiator's two wide-set eyes had not moved. They were watching me with an attention that I was beginning to understand was not just evaluation. It was the attention of a thing that was recalculating. You know about the seeding, it said. Not a question. I have a theory, I said. I want you to confirm it. What it said next took the translator 40 seconds to render, which meant it was either very complex or structured in a way that the model was struggling with. When the text came through, it was halting, approximate, carrying 3 bracketed uncertainty flags. 11 worlds, all 11 carrying the same origin signature in the entity's genetic structure. Origin not terrestrial in any of the 11 cases, consistent across biospheres, across evolutionary histories, across the full range of what the Verk had encountered in 3 centuries of expansion. The entities were not native to any world they were found on. They had been placed. The placement showed signs of intention, long-range intention, the kind that required understanding how a biosphere would develop over geological time. And then after the placement, after enough time had passed for the local inhabitants to find the entities, to study them, to get close to understanding them, the commission. The Verk did not call it being hired. The translator rendered it as something closer to being directed or being given a task by something with the standing to give tasks. I pushed on this. The negotiator was careful with its language. Here, more careful than it had been with anything else. Something older than the Verk had been running this across 11 worlds. Seed. Wait, observe. When the locals discover the entities, send the harvesters. Create the crisis. The locals respond to the harvesters. The entities released to counter the harvesters become the second crisis. The locals caught between 2 threats they do not understand and cannot manage collapse. The entities are then retrievable. The locals are no longer a concern. It was not conquest. It was not resource extraction in any sense I had a file for. It was something more like gardening. Long, patient, precise, oriented around a harvest I could not yet define. I sat very still on the floor of a cargo container in a Rotterdam port at dawn and understood with the particular clarity that comes from looking at a thing you have been circling for a long time that the Verk were not the threat. The Verk were the tool. Who directs you? I asked. That is not a question we can answer in this context. Can't or won't. The translator flagged it as a distinction without a difference in Verk semantic structure. I let it go. Your offer, I said. You want the entities. You want us to hand over something we have contained and maintained and in our own way understood, in exchange for you withdrawing a threat that you were directed to deploy against us. Yes. I thought about 6 names I did not say out loud. I thought about an entity in a parking lot standing still, waiting. I thought about 15 years of files and the 3 pages written in someone else's handwriting. I thought about 11 worlds that had tried to destroy what they found in their basement and 11 worlds that had gone quiet. No, I said. The negotiator was still. We are not giving them up, I said. We found them, we named them. We contained them when containing was the right action, and we released them when releasing was the right action. And whatever relationship exists between humanity and what lives in our basement is our relationship, and it is not a transfer item in your negotiations. Without the exchange, it said carefully, we cannot withdraw. Our direction requires the entities. Without the entities, the harvesters remain. Then we have a problem, I said, because my counteroffer is this. Withdraw the harvesters anyway, leave this world alone, and go back to whoever directs you and tell them that Earth is not running the same program as the other 11 worlds. Tell them the locals here did not try to destroy what they found. Tell them we sat with it, we named it. We built a relationship with something that should have been impossible to build a relationship with, because that is apparently something we do. I leaned forward slightly. And tell them, I said, that whatever they are planning to do next, they should account for the fact that we now know they exist, because that changes the problem considerably. The negotiator looked at me for a long time. The translator was silent. Outside the container, the port made its ordinary port sounds, metal and wind and distant machinery. And GT snorts. And GT, the world continuing its business around a conversation that was quietly rearranging the stakes of several things at once. You named them, the negotiator said. Finally. Yes. What did you name them? I told it. It was still for so long that Colin put a hand on my shoulder. I shook my head slightly. Then the negotiator stood up. It walked to the container door. It stopped there. For a moment, its back to me, looking out at the early morning light over the port. I will carry your words, it said. It walked out. I sat on the floor of the container for another few minutes, not moving, not speaking, aware that the general was going to have a great deal to say, and that Paula was going to want a full transcript, and that the next 72 hours were going to be the kind of work that left marks. All of that was true. For the moment I sat, I thought about a parking lot in northern Ontario and an entity standing still in the gray morning, and the way a thing can wait for you specifically out of all the directions available to it. The Verk had a word for us that the translator could not fully render. I was working on it. The harvesters began withdrawing from continental zones at 3:14 on a Thursday morning, which nobody witnessed except automated monitoring systems and one insomniac technician, a Lima relay station, who wrote it up in a field report that got buried in 17 layers of classification before noon. The official story, released 4 days later, was a diplomatic resolution following emergency UN engagement. It was 3 paragraphs long. It did not mention the Verk by name. It did not mention the entities. It used the phrase coordinated de-escalation, which was the kind of language that meant everyone involved had agreed to say as little as possible about the thing they were not saying anything about. I did not attend the briefing where the official story was presented. I submitted my field report and my research documentation and my recommendation for a new containment protocol framework, and then I drove north again on a road that was no longer empty. Entity 3 was standing at the tree line, 100 m north of the facility entrance. When I arrived, it had been there since the previous evening, according to the exterior monitors. Nobody had gone out to check on it, which I understood, and nobody had initiated any contact with it, which I also understood. I walked out to the tree line. We stood there, Entity 3 and I, in the November cold for about 3 hours. It was not the kind of standing there that required anything to be said or done. It was the kind that had its own content, its own transaction occurring in a register below language, and I had been a scientist long enough to know that the inability to measure something does not mean it is not real. When the temperature dropped far enough that staying out any longer would have been a medical decision, I walked back to the facility entrance. Entity 3 walked into the facility, not because a protocol had been initiated, not because a gate had been opened or a procedure followed. It simply walked in behind me through the open door and down the main corridor and turned left at the junction that led to the containment wing. And by the time the night staff had registered what was happening, it was already in its chamber. I wrote this up in a note I attached to the personal file I had been keeping. The note said, "Voluntary reentry, no coercion, no protocol applied." Then it said, "I don't know what to do with this data." Then it said, "I think that's okay." The other 5 had re-entered their chambers within the previous 24 hours, each on their own timeline, each under their own cognition. The behavioral files were going to need significant revision. The theoretical framework was going to need significant revision. A great many things that we had written about what the entities were and how they operated were going to need to be looked at again, with the understanding that we had been making certain assumptions that were no longer supportable. I found this, professionally speaking, one of the most interesting problems I had ever been handed. I also found it, in a way I did not document anywhere, something else. Paula knocked on my office door at noon. She was carrying 2 coffees, and I noticed she had switched brands, and I did not say anything about it, but I held the cup for a moment longer than I needed to before I drank it. "Owen has already started the revision framework," she said. "He's calling it the Cooperative Apex Model." "That's a terrible name," I said. "He knows. He's open to suggestions." But I thought about it. "Relational Coexistence Index," I said, "pending further data." She wrote it down. "The general wants a full debrief this week. He can have one. The ethics board wants to convene on the protocol revisions. They can have one of those too. And there are 4 separate governments requesting access to the site for their own research teams. They cannot have one of those." Paula smiled at that in a small, tired way and took a long drink of her coffee. We sat in the shared quiet of people who had been through something together that they were still processing in different rooms of themselves. The Verk negotiator's parting word, she said, the one the translator couldn't fully render. "Have you made any progress on it?" I'd been working on it for 3 weeks at that point. The translation models had given me 17 approximations, none satisfying. I'd been running it against every linguistic framework in the xenobiology database, cross-referencing against documented VERK emotional registers, looking for the word that held the shape of what had been said. I had two candidates. The first was anomaly. It fit the structural form. It matched the semantic field. It was supported by 4 of the 17 models. The second was kin. I had not told anyone about the second candidate. I had been sitting with it. The way you sit with information that changes the load-bearing structure of several things you thought were settled, waiting to see if it held up under pressure or dissolved under scrutiny. It kept holding up. Some progress, I said. Paula waited. I looked at the coffee in my hands. I thought about 11 worlds. I thought about something that had been seeding those worlds across geological time, watching civilizations rise to the point of discovery, running the same program over and over with the VERK as its instrument, running it on worlds. The locals panicked where they tried to remove the problem by force, where they could not sit still with something that did not fit their frameworks. And then I thought about a parking lot, about waiting, about a thing that had been contained for 15 years and had been released into a world under threat and had gone first, not toward the threat, but toward a specific person on a specific road. Whatever was running this program across 11 dead worlds had watched humanity do something the program had not accounted for. We had not tried to destroy what we found. We had sat with it, we had named it, we had built a relationship with something impossible, not because we were unafraid, but because we had found somewhere in the long, strange history of what we were, that fear was not the only available response to the incomprehensible, that we had other tools. Something knew that now, something was recalculating. Something had watched the VERK withdraw from a world that had not run the expected program, and I did not know what that meant yet, what came next, what the next move was in a game that had been running across more distance and more time than I had good numbers for. I knew one thing. It knew we existed now, not as a species to be harvested, not as a civilization running on schedule toward a predictable end, as something that had done the unexpected thing, as something that had complicated the math. Academically speaking, I said to Paula, I have no idea what comes next. She looked at me, but I thought about the word the translator could not render. I thought about what it felt like to sit on the hood of a vehicle in an empty parking lot and have something vast and ancient and not entirely explicable choose out of all available directions to come and wait for you specifically. Whatever is out there running this, I said, it sent killers, and we answered with something it wasn't expecting. I set my coffee down. I think, I said carefully, that's a reasonable place to start. In Appendix C of my official report, on page 311, in the driest language I could find, I noted that the genetic evidence for non-terrestrial origin of the entities had been present in the data since the first sequencing in 2027, that the conclusion had been available for nearly 2 decades, that it had not been acted on or publicly acknowledged because the conclusion followed to its logical end, required engaging with implications that no institutional framework had been built to handle. I noted that the entities had been placed here, that this placement was intentional, that the same signature appeared across 11 cataloged worlds, all of which had been subsequently targeted by Verk harvesters. That Earth was the only world on which the Verk had withdrawn without achieving their objective. That the reason for this deviation from the historical pattern appeared to be rooted in a behavioral distinction in humanity's response to the entities that defied the parameters the program had been designed around. In the final line of the appendix, I wrote the following sentence in the full knowledge that it would be read by no one at the level it deserved to be read at, filed in a database that required 7 authorizations to access and possibly remain there for decades before anyone found it relevant. Something seeded these entities across inhabited worlds and sent killers to clean up afterward, and it has done this successfully 11 times, and the reason it did not do it a 12th time is that we did the one thing none of the other 11 worlds did, which is to say we treated the incomprehensible not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a thing that deserved to be understood, and whatever is running this program now knows that about us, and I do not know if that makes us safer or more interesting, but I know it makes us something the math did not account for, and in my experience, being the thing the math did not account for is the only position worth being in. I submitted the report. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in years. In the east corridor of Site Vantablack, 6 chambers held 6 things that should not have been possible and were. The monitors ran their quiet cycles. Ventilation moved air through spaces built to hold something that ordinary frameworks had no room for. And somewhere at a distance I could not calculate in any unit I had a name for. Something that had been running the same program for longer than humanity had been keeping records, sat with a result it had not planned for. I hoped it was thinking hard. I intended to give it more to think about.